My name is Alan Dalton. I'm a member of the faculty in the economics department here at Boise State University. And on behalf of the department, I wish to welcome you to the inaugural Adam Smith Lecture sponsored by the department. Funding of tonight's event has been provided by the John Templeton Foundation through a gift from the Institute for Humane Studies. At the conclusion of tonight's speech, the very last slide, you'll be given a link to an online survey which our donors would like you to fill out. So that would be nice if you would do so. The department has established the Adam Smith Lecture Series in order to bring to the Boise State campus nationally and, in tonight's case, internationally recognized scholars who have deepened our understanding of and extended the work of Adam Smith. Adam Smith, I hope most of you know, if not all of you, was an 18th century Scottish moral philosopher, and he established his reputation with two works, The Theory of Moral Sentiments and The Wealth of Nations. Those books, even though they were written in the 18th century, continue to enlighten and inform us concerning the two spheres of interaction within which humans engage. The first, which our speaker tonight will talk about, is the intimate sphere of personal exchange, typified by friendships, family, and voluntary non-market institutions like churches or clubs. The second sphere is the impersonal sphere of market exchange, which gives occasion to the specialization and division of labor, which has produced the wealth we enjoy, or at least in those nations that have embraced markets and the necessary underlying institutions of the rule of law and private property. Tonight's speaker has considerably added to our understanding of the relationship between those two spheres, and that is why we sought him out for this first lecture. How people's moral sentiments lay the foundation for the necessary cooperation upon which markets are based. It is my great honor to introduce tonight's speaker. Vernon Smith was born in Wichita, Kansas on January 1st, 1927. His early life is detailed in his autobiography, Discovery, a memoir, and I think everyone would benefit from reading that. He received his bachelor's degree in electrical engineering from the California Institute of Technology, or simply Caltech for short, in 1949, an M.A. in economics from the University of Kansas in 1952, and his Ph.D. in economics from Harvard in 1955. His teaching career began at Purdue University, where he was for 12 years, from 55 through 67, followed by appointments, and this was way before his time in some sense. He moved to Brown so that his wife could have her first job in Massachusetts. He followed his appointment at Brown with an appointment at the University of Massachusetts, then Stanford, back to Caltech, the University of Arizona, where he did most of his work in experimental economics from 1976 to 2001, George Mason University, and the University of Alaska Anchorage. He is currently the George L. Argyros Endowed Chair in Finance and Economics at Chapman University in Orange, California. His publications are numerous. His Vita has 25 pages listing his journal articles, contributions to books, and books. I will mention but two articles. His 1962 An Experimental Study of Competitive Market Behavior, that in many ways inaugurated the field of experimental economics, and his 1988 co-authored paper, Bubbles, Crashes, and Endogenous Expectations in Experimental Spot Asset Markets, that investigates how asset markets often boom and bust. In 2002, Professor Smith was a co-recipient of the Bank of Sweden. I don't know Swedish, so I'm not going to try the Swedish version of it, but it's the Bank of Sweden Prize in Economic Sciences in memory of Alfred Nobel, the Nobel Prize for short in economic sciences. for, quote, having established laboratory experiments as a tool in empirical economic analysis, especially in the study of alternative market mechanisms. Any student of economics, and I know there are a lot of my students here, who has played the demand and supply game in the classroom is replicating that foundational experiment of his 1962 paper that Professor Smith developed to teach the coordinating features of markets that lead to the equilibrium prices established by individual demands and supplies. His experimental work on markets, cooperative behavior, and personal exchange continues in his 90th year. He continues to be an active scholar. Please welcome the inaugural speaker in BSU's Adam Smith Lecture Series, Professor Vernon Smith.
Well, thank you, Professor Dalton. It's a great honor here to be the inaugural speaker of this great series. What an honor. And I need to point out that I am not an Adam Smith scholar. Although I read The Wealth of Nations as a graduate student at the University of Kansas, and that would have been in the fall of 1950, I didn't discover the theory of moral sentiments until decades later. But I would say the last 15 to 20 years, it's been really exciting for me to find a new way of thinking about the experimental games that we were doing in the 80s and 90s that just baffled us. I mean, the standard model just went down in flames. The Max U sort of model went down in flames. And although we adapted to that and had some stories we told, there weren't any good ones. But I found that in a book written in 1759, just a remarkable way of thinking about how people conduct themselves in those games. So, and I want to relate. I'm going to do kind of an overview of sort of elements in the theory of moral sentiments. And then I want to take some key propositions there in the theory of moral sentiments and apply them to some new experimental games, trust games, but they're new games, but they're the same kinds that we ran back in the late 80s and early 90s that so contradicted the standard economic model. So I'm returning to those, and then I want to, though, after going through some of those games, I want to talk about the big themes in the theory of moral sentiments that relate to the wealth of nations, and so connect back to this title, Moral Sentiments and the Wealth of Nations. All right, so, the notion that we all live simultaneously in two different worlds, I was first introduced to that in Hayek's book, The Fatal Conceit. On page 18 in The Fatal Conceit, I'll never forget it. There's a couple of paragraphs that open that up. And I read that, quite many years ago, about in the early 90s. And the first world that we live in is our social communities, what Alan mentioned, of family, friends, neighbors, churches, local organizations. And these are all, with our acquaintances, we are very concerned to be other regarding, toward each other, and in these close-knit groups. What David Hume, writing in Adam Smith's day, called it disinterested commerce. It's interesting, the word commerce, you see, he used. Disinterested commerce. And then secondly, there's this larger world of market transactions with others, including strangers, where our behavior tends to be self-regarding. Hume called that interested commerce. Well, Adam Smith wrote 2 books, one on each of these topics, okay? And the first, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, 1759, it went through 5 more editions. It went through a 6th edition in 1790 and was finished not too long before he died. And I don't think there's any question but what he considered that book his most important work. But posterity would judge otherwise. Because in 1776, he wrote The Wealth of Nations. And ladies and gentlemen, that was a spectacular book for its time. Jefferson and George Washington, Ben Franklin, all those guys that founded the American Republic would have known The Wealth of Nations. They probably also knew The Theory of Moral Sentiments. It was in American libraries. And you needed to know your John Locke and your David Hume, but particularly Adam Smith. Okay? And The Wealth of Nations was very influential with leading political figures. The Prime Minister, now I'm thinking of I'm showing my age, the younger, I can't think of his name now. Yes, he was Prime Minister 17 years. Adam Smith met him, and there was a reception for Adam Smith, and in the dinner he talked with the Prime Minister. Later, he was told a friend, he says, he knows my system better than I do. He was really impressed, you see, so that really, I think, it goes a long way to accounting for the enormous success of The Wealth of Nations, and in a way it sort of swamped The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which had been very well received earlier when it came out and was a distinguished, considered a very scholarly and important contribution, but it was sort of dwarfed by The Theory of Moral Sentiments. Okay, here's the, if we look at the subtitles in this is a 1853 edition, it says it's an essay towards an analysis of the principles by which men naturally judge concerning the conduct and character, first of their neighbors and afterwards of themselves. We first learn from our neighbors about what we do that they like and what we do that they resent. Okay, we learn that in our relations, and then gradually we begin to realize that, wait a minute, they're seeing me in a similar way. And so it's about, you see, the book is in a way, it is what has to do with learning to see ourselves as others see us, and then how that shapes our conduct, you see, in our social communities. Okay, why study Adam Smith? Well, Sentiments provides a model of human conduct that seamlessly connects action in social groupings with that in markets. There's not a problem that we're really of two minds. As Adam Smith said, we're sort of one mind, okay? And we're self-loving, but doesn't mean we're always selfish, you see. Okay, and it also offers prior propositions. Prior, a long time ago, propositions predicting action where standard models fail decisively to predict laboratory behavior in two-person games. And this is in the 1990s. And I'm going to, in this paper now, apply these propositions to some new versions of those trust games. And also, propositions, he articulates propositions that predict action in unique, new experimental designs. I can't imagine thinking of doing those experiments if I hadn't read Adam Smith. So it's, and that's always impressive. a theory, a new theory is always very impressive to people when it explains old data and then predicts new kinds, new designs, and new results if you do the experiments. That's exactly what the theory of relativity did. It accounted for everything that Newton did and made new predictions, which turned out to be, right on. So that's one of the reasons why that was such a, the theory of relativity was such a widely and fairly quickly accepted. And finally, Adam Smith connects human conduct in experimental games and life to broad social themes of property, beneficence, justice, and wealth creation in stable societies. And I'm sort of toward the end kind of get into that. Okay, now I want to first talk about what Sentiments is not about. And this slide is mostly for economists, okay? Because actually a lot of other people don't see why there's a particular problem. But economists, you see, are trained to think in terms of maximization. Okay, and particularly what's called maximizing utility over own outcomes. So we think in terms of a process in which an action leads to an outcome, and that outcome has personal value to the individual, yields utility, and that's why you choose it. Okay, well, that's not the process in Adam Smith. It is when you come to markets, okay, so it has provision, but when he's talking about the theory of moral sentiments, that's not what he's talking about. Yet he does assume implicitly that people are self-interested. And in fact, if you're not self-interested, you don't know what it is that hurts and benefits other people. So it's important. So the notion of that kind of everyone considers people to be self-interested in that sense is an important input, you see, to his way of modeling us people as social creatures. It's not about altruism. Well, it can't be. That word doesn't come in the English language for another 100 years. But it's also not about his teacher, Adam Smith's teacher, Francis Hutcheson, talked about humans having a benevolent sense. And Adam Smith kind of never accepted that. A lot of what is in the theory of moral sentiments had to do with kind of correcting kind of what was some of the current interpretations. It wasn't about reason or the so-called social contract, the Hobbes. It's also not about social preferences, and that's where we talk about there being a utility not only for our own outcome, but the other's outcome. And this is kind of the model that became popular after the old model and these two-person games kind of crashed and burned. Behavioral and experimental economists moved and tended to all adopt the notion that, well, it's just we didn't have the right utility function. I never was able to accept that. It was too ad hoc. It was too convenient, and it wasn't really giving you an understanding, you see, about what's going on in those games. And though I kind of tried to fill in and come and with my some of my experimental colleagues, I never felt that we had a good grasp of what was going on in those games. Well, gradually I came to see answers being supplied by Adam Smith. They weren't transparent at all to me in the beginning. It took I had to return to it many times before it started to come through. Well, what's Sentiments about? Well, it's about human sociality as other regarding conduct. He uses the word conduct, not behavior. See, the word conduct suggests a pattern. You see, a manner, a kind of more of a lifestyle. You see, a way of conducting yourself in situations. So it's a broader sort of a notion than the narrower concept of behavior, what a thing does. It's about rule-following conduct. It's propriety and fitness. Propriety has to do with approval and disapproval. Rules emerge by consent and become conventions or kind of norms, you see. It's about accounting for social order in a pre-civil society. See, society is talking about, Smith is talking about a world long before we have, a modern civil government. And it's about sympathy and particularly mutual sympathetic fellow feeling. He has this idea of empathy, but that word's not available yet. Empathy is a 20th century word. It comes in around 1905. But clearly Smith, in his notion of sympathetic fellow feeling and resonance, you see, has that notion in mind. He uses the word fair, but it's not about outcomes. He's not talking about outcomes being fair. He's referring to fair play. The opposite of unfair is foul. Unfair is foul, okay? And there's a great thing you can read on that. Anna Wierzbicka, she's a Polish, great Polish linguist. She's at Australian National University in Australia. And she has a book called English, in which she points out that fair is a unique English word. It has no translation into any other European languages, let alone non-European language. So hence, how do Germans and Poles use the word fair? They use the English word because they didn't have one. And they just adopt that. And of course the French won't adopt anyone's word, so they just don't have that word. But it's a great reading that, and I'm telling you, it's pretty powerful, and she gives you the evidence for that. Well, also in sentiments, actions there are signals that convey intentions or conduct. And in particular, the actions you don't take are also important. In economics, that's opportunity cost. But it's an important part of the reading of the meaning in whatever action you do take to know what the other person might have done. And we're going to see that in these games. So we read these actions imperfectly in context. And then finally, propriety involved in the property, in Adam Smith's view, in the civil order of government. Okay, I'm going to give you several of Smith's axioms and principles of conduct. Here's the first two. Now, the fundamental axiom is that self-interest is common knowledge. For each, and we would, in modern economics, we would say self-interested and non-satiated. Okay, more is always better, less is worse. Okay. And as Smith puts it in the process, when he describes the process of our maturation, he says, we humble the arrogance of our self-love to bring it down to what others will go along with. You do a word count, a phrase count, go along with, it appears 41 times in the Theory of Moral Sentiments. He wants you to get it. Okay? So it's about, and he has a wonderful mental experiment to kind of get across the way, how it is he's thinking about this. He says, imagine a member of the species growing up entirely isolated without having any contact with another member of the human species. He says that person can no more know what it means for his mind to be deformed than for his face to be deformed. And Smith says, bring him into society and you give him the mirror he needs. So the whole idea is that, others are a mirror whereby we learn of ourselves. We find out who we are you see, through this. And without others, we'd never know. Wouldn't know what it means, even for a face deformed, anything. Also, all of that comes out of social context. And as Smith says, you look your neighbor in the face and avow that all your decisions are driven by self-interest, even though that's an important part of the input to our socialization. And then, secondly, human desire, and think of that as a motivation for conduct in Smith's work, is expressed as a fundamental asymmetry between gains and losses. In the gain domain, we have a desire for praise and for praiseworthiness. In the loss domain, we desire to avoid blame and blameworthiness. And he's talking here in terms of praise and blame. He's talking about not only our material well-being and health, but also self-esteem and reputation and how others see us. So it's the gain and loss domains are very much a social and not only just an individual phenomenon. And moreover, he doesn't just postulate this gain-loss asymmetry. He actually derives it from his discussion of a fundamental asymmetry between our joy and our sorrow, in which he says that the amount in any given situation, the amount by which you can improve and do better is nothing compared to the amount by which you can lose. The depths of despair that you can be thrown into. And so that's the way he thinks about that fundamental asymmetry in gains and losses. And now my colleague, Danny Kahneman, who shared the Nobel Prize, he and Amos Tversky, I think some of the most important work they did was in finding that people were very sensitive to a difference between gains and loss. That's a very important contribution. Probably the most the contributions that I think that they latched onto fairly early and became the most lasting. And it's interesting, though, that if you go back and read the Theory of Moral Sentiments, you see that very cleanly and neatly articulated. Now, of course, the psychologists, economists, none of us cited Adam Smith because we didn't know about him. You see, so the Theory of Moral Sentiments had no influence on any of this. And so it's been some people talk about the rediscovery of Adam Smith. Well, I would say that for me, a lot of it is a discovery. You can't rediscover what was never discovered. I mean, I think we've learned things about things in Adam Smith that were never, ever brought out. This is one where it's a rediscovery, okay, it was, but there are many things I think are really quite new. Okay, and then third, actions are signals shaped by their propriety in the given circumstances or context. Circumstances, including payoffs, allow intentions to be conveyed in actions, which you can think of those as signals, to be sent and read by others. But when doing this, we tend to be rule followers, but it doesn't mean that we're self-aware that we're following rules. A lot of these rules we absorb and follow without really thinking about them, and they become habitual. And I want to give you an example of a personal experience that I had a few years ago. And I thought a lot about this experience in the context of the Theory of Moral Sentiments, and it helped me to understand what Adam Smith was talking about. Okay, my wife Candace and I lived part of the year in Tucson. We still own a house there. And in the suburbs in Tucson, the homeless occupy islands on the main intersections. okay, in the suburbs, and they sell newspapers. Well, one day I'm at the corner of Swan and Sunrise, which is the nearest main intersection to our home, and the familiar figure is on the island. And by the way, it's always the same one. They have property rights. I don't know how it works, but it's always the same one. And if he's not there, there's nobody there. Okay, so they've got this worked out. So this familiar figure is there. And so I pull over, roll down the window, and, well, I don't really read print media anymore. I read stuff online, and although I'd occasionally buy a paper from him, I often didn't read it. So I typically give him $5 for the $2 paper, see? So I'm reaching the $5 out, and he's got the newspaper in his right hand that he's reaching to me, and he's reaching for the $5 bill. And I say, that's okay, you can keep the paper. He pulled back. He says, I only sell newspapers. And wow. Fortunately, I got it. And I recovered, and I said, that's okay, I'll take the paper. And he smiled, and he took the $5. Now, you see, it's all right for me to give him 2.5 times what the paper's price is, but it's not all right for me to not take the newspaper. That was just not acceptable. Well, and then I got more insight on this. A few weeks later, my wife Candace and I were in the Safeway store, which is near that intersection, and it was about 3:30 in the afternoon, and he was inside. And he was talking to some high school students that had just gone out. And Candace turns to me and she says, you know, he does not look very good. She says, I'm going to give him $5. I said, wait, don't. Ask him if he's got a newspaper. And so she did. She went up and she asked, she says, do you have a newspaper? Oh, he says, yes, I've got, he says, let me go get you one. He went clear out to the island and got his newspaper, brought it in, and he explained, he says, you know, he says, some of my customers want yesterday's newspaper, so if I have any left over, I save them for the next day. You know, the guy's a businessman. He's got customers. He knows his customers, and he takes care of them. I mean, he's a man of pride and integrity, you see. And I learned from the feedback I got from him that my rule was not right, was not the right rule. You know, it was out of sync, and I learned and I changed. But anyway, I think that's the way I like to think about the rules we follow and that Adam Smith is talking about. They have a very strong structure. They're very, very context dependent. They carry a lot of detail, and there's a lot of stuff in them, you know. And those rules are constantly being kind of adjusted and changed in response and so forth, because we make errors. All right. Okay, I want to consider the following laboratory experiment. We call it a trust game. We don't call it that for the people who are in the experiments. And imagine you're in a room with, say, there's an even number in the room. There might be 12 or 16. And you're each sitting at the terminals of in a private area, and you are you have a keyboard, and you can see a computer model and monitor in front of you. Well, you are matched anonymously at random with someone else in the room. You'll never know who that is. You'll be paid whatever your earnings are privately and separately at the end of the experiment, one at a time. And so here's the game that and this is, I say, very similar to the ones we did in 1990s, although we've increased the monetary rewards a little bit on them. So here we call this, I call this the baseline no punishment game. That's because later we're going to introduce a punishment option. that you'll see shortly. Now, okay, and you are matched, so you're matched with someone else, and it's a random one of you is person 1 and the other is person 2. Okay. Okay, and person 1, if they play right, it's over, and you each will earn and receive $12 in cash. If 1 passes to 2, the $24 becomes $48, and if 2 plays right, $18 is earned by person 1 and $30 for person 2. Or person 2 can play down and earn $42, leaving 1 with only 6. Okay. So that's the game. And in this game, you just play it once, it's over, and people file out one at a time and are paid. And when we recruit another group to the lab, we'll make sure that they're all first time in this game. Okay. Okay, now here's this is called an extensive form game. It's played out in sequence, okay? And here's the traditional analysis of that. First, assume that there's common knowledge that all players are strictly self-interested and non-satiated. Secondly, only payoff outcomes matter in choosing action. In particular, your own payoff only matters. You apply what we call backward induction to the game tree. You determine each player's choice and reverse sequence of play. So if you look at this game, you see that if player 1 passes to player 2, 2 can move down. It's in his interest to move down because 42 is greater than 30. 2 only gets $6, so 1 should never pay to play down. The prediction is that 1 would play right, and that was the equilibrium of the game for 2 self-interested players. Well, here's the typical outcome. We ran 49 pairs. That's 98 individuals in this game. And you'll see that 45% of them play right, 55% play down. But look at what the 2s do. 2/3 of them are playing right. Okay? They are choosing what we would call the cooperative outcome. 1/3 are defecting on that offer of, think of person 1 as offering to cooperate by passing to them. So well, the standard model, you see, just crashed and burned with the earliest games that we did. And here it is again, many years later, where we're repeating these games now and thinking about them in the context of the theory of moral sentiments. Okay, so it's failing, but there's a proposition in sentiments that indicates why 2/3 of player 2s do not take most of the money, and why over half of player 1s might pass to them. We call it, Bart Wilson and I call it Beneficence Proposition 1. It's not numbered or doesn't carry a name in Smith. It's on page 78. But it says that properly motivated, and from his examples, you see he's talking about intentional, properly motivated actions that benefit others alone deserve reward. Why? It's because of the gratitude that other people feel in response to such actions. That's the proposition, and he's deriving that proposition from the earlier discussion that I gave you a quick overview on. How would you, now, from a Smith point of view, how would you analyze this game? Well, let's think. Let me share with you kind of the way I come out on this. Well, in analyzing the game, you see it involves benefit or hurt for each player. It involves inferred intentions. It's about imagining the other's situation. And it's also about what Adam Smith calls self-command. The ability with in our relations to others is to control the urge in the marginal moment to take most of the money or to behave And so that's an important part of it, is this self-discipline that he claims most of us learn about. Okay, so now what's the first point here? It's the same as in the other one, common knowledge that all players are strictly self-interested and non-satiated. Action is guided by who is hurt or benefits from an action, and an inference of intent. Hurt, benefit, and intentions are inferred from alternative actions that might be taken. And then here in 4, intentional beneficence leads to gratitude, leads to a willingness to reward because of the gratitude that's felt. And then I'm going to give you the justice proposition shortly, but that involves intentional hurt, causing resentment, and the urge to punish. We'll come to that shortly. Okay. Well, you apply backward induction in the game, just as indicated before, to determine who benefits or is hurt from an action at each of the nodes. Okay, and you need to make a judgment of intent. Each player's impartial spectator imagines herself in the role of the other in judging intent and probable responses or consequences, and that may be without any notion that you are actually thinking that through. But Smith argues, you see, that we acquire this habit of looking at ourselves from the perspective of others, and particularly the impartial spectator is the metaphor for that. So then, forward play is a signaling game. You see, it's a conversation that conveys intent. So if player 1 would cooperate in the player 2 role, will player 2 actually that you're going up against see it in the same way? That's the open question you see to person 1. And will player 2 cooperate, given this unambiguous signal, you see, of players 1's beneficial intentions? So we see here that the results are consistent with this model in sentiments. Knowing the action taken by player 1, we have 18 of 27 player 2s showing gratitude and self-command in this population we've sampled. Now note that because we're randomly assigning people between person 1 and person 2, that implies that the same proportion of 1s, if they had been in the 2 position, 2/3 would have done the same. That's the implication. So what does that mean? But less than 2/3 are playing down the first position. What does that tell you? Uncertainty about the kind of person they're matched with. And in fact, 67% minus the number of people who play cooperatively in the second position minus the 55% of ones that are passing to them gives you an estimate here of the number of people who are sort of deterred because of uncertainty about the kind of person that they're matched with. So my point is that you have a way of thinking about this game, you see, that we didn't have in the 80s and 90s when we first started to do them. So, okay, now, new trust games motivated by additional propositions and sentiments. Okay, here's beneficence proposition 2. Again, it's not numbered or named in there. But beneficence is always free. It cannot be extorted by force. In other words, failure to act beneficently, what Adam Smith called want of beneficence, calls for no punishment because actions tend, quote, to do no real positive evil. Okay, so in trust games, we should not expect player 2s to feel resentment and be willing to incur a cost to punish player 1s for choosing not to be beneficent. In other words, not to pass to them. That's sort of their respected right. That's what we infer from the theory of moral sentiment. So how do we test that? Well, here's the game that we use to test that. You see, now, if one decides to play the equilibrium of the game and choose 12-12, play goes to 2. And now 2 chooses a 12-12, or if 2 doesn't like it, that 1 failed to offer to cooperate, to play down, 2 can take $10 rather than 12 and give him $10 rather than 12 to the other person. So here's an opportunity to punish that behavior. Now you'll notice here that we've added a dominated option. You see, we've added an option where it's strictly better for 2 not to take it, and you see, in the traditional Max U analysis, dominated options were always irrelevant. In fact, there were even theorems that allowed you to go through and take all those out because no one would play those. But you notice here in sentiments, it's the essence of the thing. It's a part of the conversation. It's part of the signaling. Is to have these options in there. People read them. Okay, they are central to interpreting the meaning of the choice that you do make. Okay, so do people punish want of benefits? No. We had, so of 38 persons, of the 38 who play this game, we have 23 moving right. That's 61%. None of the 2s punished them. Bart Wilson and I, first ran 25 pairs. There was none that did it. And we thought, this can't be right. There's no theory that's that good. Okay, so we ran 13 more pairs. And it's still nobody felt the need to punish this. I mean, incredible. But notice here that it changes play generally in the game. Okay, we now have, you see, instead of 45% right in the game on the left, we now have 61%. We have a lot more people playing. Fewer people are playing down. Moreover, they're right not to play down because there's more 2s defecting. You see, people are reading this game. 2, you see, now to move down is not necessarily read as an unambiguous act of beneficence. 2 can read 1 as moving down because he's afraid that 2 is going to punish him if he moves right. You see. So now people are starting to read this game differently and they play it differently. Okay? So that's the really great power, I think, in Adam Smith. Okay, now here's Justice Proposition 1. Improperly motivated actions that are hurtful to others alone deserve punishment. This is because others feel resentment for such actions. This is just the obverse, you see, of Beneficence Proposition 1. So suppose player 2 defects on the offer of player 1 to cooperate. This proposition predicts that many players 1s feel resentment and are willing to incur costs to punish player 2s. So we give them, and testing that, this is the option. So now if 2 decides to defect, it goes back to 1. And 1 chooses between the defection outcome and can, at a cost of $2 to himself, give only $4 to person 2. Okay. Okay, now, and here's the baseline game over there on the left, and here's the new one on the right. So 24% of the 1s punish defection, if you look down at the bottom. But more 1s now play down, and more 2s defect. you see, the signal is less credible with that punishment threat in there. Now, if you see, you have more people now happy to move down because they figure that guy, he's going to cooperate because I can come back and hit him. So twos no longer read, in the eyes of Adam Smith, no longer read the twos as doing a completely beneficent act. So anyway, you see why I'm so excited about Adam Smith? This gives me a way of thinking about these games that we didn't have. Well, then finally here, we introduce you can punish either one of beneficence or hurt. Doing well, now that kind of balances it up. We now have a whole lot fewer ones moving right at the top and playing down. In fact, it's up to 70%. So people are now all reading this game quite differently. And in fact, we're having a few people now punishing one of beneficence. We're having two, that's 15%. So you see, you add a node, add an option that change the way people see the game. And they look at it differently, they read the actions differently, and what's powerful is Adam Smith in 1759 came up with these propositions that we're getting so much mileage on in the 21st century. Okay, now in sentiments, Justice Proposition 1 is used by Smith to explain the origin of property rights. You see, he's not taking in the direction of what do people do in the laboratory. He's talking about the major themes you see that come out of this analysis. So common feelings of resentment toward improperly motivated actions of a hurtful nature within close-knit communities is the origin of the civil order of law, as Smith sees it, and of punishment proportioned to resentment. And here's the key quote: as the greater and more irreparable the evil that is done, the resentment of the sufferer runs naturally the higher. And now Sentiments combines this proposition with that earlier principle that I told you about, the asymmetry of gains and losses. He combines those two concepts to explain differential penalties applied to loss of property under law in nation states. And it just shows you how precise Adam Smith is and how far he takes these fundamental concepts. He says, to be deprived of that which we are possessed of is a greater evil than to be disappointed of what we have only the expectation. Breach of property, therefore, theft and robbery, which take from us what we are possessed of, are greater crimes than breach of contract, which only disappoints us of what we expected. The most sacred laws of justice, therefore, those whose violation seems to call loudest for vengeance and punishment, or the laws which guard the life and person of our neighbor, the next are those which guard his property and possessions, and last are those which are due to him from the promises of others. And so he brings that asymmetry between gains and losses in to explain why it is in law we have that differential punishment. So what does this mean? Well, under the rule of law, the classical liberal heritage, justice is a residue. See, justice is what is left over after introducing penalties for unjust action. Society seeks good. It achieves human betterment by discouraging the bad. Okay? Things like theft, robbery, violation of contract, bearing of false witness, they go clear back to the Ten Commandments. Okay, they're so ancient. So that's Smith's. That's kind of the classical traditional. Of course, modern day, we want to do good, and we're always passing legislation to do good. Why is Smith making this argument? I think he's making this argument because essentially the thing that we have a common experience with from our past history are things that are hurtful, that we resent very much, and we fairly easily get agreement on that. And that, you see, becomes tradition, and that gets embodied into the rule of law. Now, the problem with deliberately doing good things is that's the future, you see. You're less likely to get agreement on it because there's all kinds of things may not work out. You see, because it's new, you don't have an experiential base. And so doing good is fraught with unintended consequences. So I think that's, and of course we've introduced a lot of that in the modern day, but and it's taken away from that original tradition. But it's that tradition that's got it started and very much influenced the founding of our own republic and really most of our history. Okay, now another proposition, Justice Proposition 2, that I want to take up now is that the breach of justice calls for punishment, but observing the rules of justice seems scarce to deserve any reward. So there's no rewards for stopping at a red light or not disturbing your neighbor. These are your duty under the rule of law. Just as we don't punish want of beneficence, we don't provide a reward for people that follow the law. So you get that symmetry. Okay, here's a game to test that in this framework of this basic trust game. Suppose we introduce the possibility that if 2 moves right here, to get the cooperative outcome, 1830, the play first goes through 1. And 1 can transfer an additional $2 from himself to that person. Now, Adam Smith's thinking suggests that people won't do that. Well, here's the results. We're actually getting what... sorry, I'm having trouble reading this. We're getting, out of 14 that move right, we're getting 10 paying the 1830. 4 apparently are so happy that 2 didn't defect on them, they're willing to give it an extra $2. And this is the last games that we've been running. And one of the things I want to do, though, is to do this where, in the context where the punishment option exists, so that if 2 plays down, it goes to 1 and 1 can punish them, because I think that's a better context in which to actually look at this particular proposition. All right, sentiments in the wealth of nations, tying these together. Think of property rights as necessary but not sufficient in wealth. Smith adds what I like to call his axiom of discovery, the propensity to truck, barter, and exchange one thing from another. So human sociality and sentiments is expressed as exchange or trade in wealth. Third-party enforcement of property means that people do not have to depend on trust and trustworthiness for mutually beneficial transactions. If you've got a third party of enforcement, you can trade with people you don't know. So giving and receiving are simultaneous. We can discharge those obligations. Well, this really sets the stage, you see, for the 18th century takeoff in wealth creation that's continued down to the present time. And notice that when you study economics today, the standard approach to it is that, well, people have there's technology out there, people have preferences, there's resources, and what markets do is aggregate all that dispersed information into prices and outcomes to give you an equilibrium. That's not the way Smith talks about it. He begins with trade, an exchange. Well, an exchange means if people are exchanging things, there's prices. Prices now enable you to make comparisons. If you're a farmer growing corn and hogs, as soon as there's a price for corn and hogs, you can ask yourself, well, wait a minute, should I grow hogs on my farm or grow more corn and get the hogs through trade? So you can now make calculations. And people now start to see, in Smith's view, as I put it together, he sees this as a discovery process where people find out what they can best specialize in. It's not that the given information is out there. You have to find out what that information is. And I think in modern economics, starting with the neoclassical revolution of the marginal revolution of the 1870s, when we moved over to more formal systems and equilibrium, we lost that process way of thinking. And it's why, in the first experiments that I did, that Alan mentioned, that the first experiment I did was in January 1956 at Purdue, and I had a class of 22 people. I made 5 of them buyers, 5 of them sellers. They each had their own private value if they were a seller, or cost, value if they were a buyer, cost if they were a seller. And I thought, I will get them before they've read any economics. They don't know anything. I'll give them strictly private information and show that, you see, without complete information, markets will have a really hard time finding the equilibrium. Well, I was wrong. They found it. They found it quickly. But you see, I am thinking in that marginal utility, that mechanistic way. I'm not thinking about process, what people do on the ground, you see, to discover things, and how together then that enables them to do things that's not part of their intention, to achieve outcomes that are beyond their immediate myopic view. And that first experiment, I thought there was something wrong with it. And one thing I thought was wrong was it was symmetric, so that the average value was the average cost was equal to the price. And I thought that was a flaw in the experiment. So I did a very asymmetric case. It converged too. Every experiment I did converged, you see. And so I gradually realized there was something seriously wrong with my education. Okay, this will be a hard slide for me, maybe for you to read. You notice most of my slides, it's easy to read. That's so I can read them, okay? So from sentiments to wealth, and through each to human betterment. So on the left here, we have pre-civil society, and we have this human species with this capacity for sentiments. And that means that from that comes the rules of propriety, based on fellow feeling, the pleasures of mutual sympathy, self-command, all of these elements in Adam Smith. And then that leads on the right to human social psychological betterment. And then as we move down in the direction of the civil order of society and a civil order of government, the rules of propriety, this long practiced traditions, we just naturally move them and they become the rule of law. And it's natural for us to do that. Why reinvent the wheel, okay? And then Smith adds this, what I call his axiom, propensity to truck, barter, and exchange, and that jump-starts wealth creation, and now we have human economic betterment. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. And here's the
Professor Smith will gladly take a few questions. Any questions?
You said that humans, we have a sense of, we want to be praised, but is that sense of praise, does it have diminishing returns?
I'm sorry, what have diminishing returns?
Oh, you said that us humans have a sense of praise, that we want to have...
Oh, praise?
Yes.
And praiseworthiness? Yeah, yes, I think it's reasonable to suppose that that's not just, you see, I've given you kind of discrete examples in these games, you know, but it's reasonable to suppose that that is a continuous sort of phenomena. And I think, you know, what Bart Wilson and I have done, it just kind of opens up the possibility for, you see, possibilities that are yet to be explored. There's a huge area here for, I think, starting with these basic concepts and carry it further. Smith is very much non-utilitarian, even though, you see, underneath everything is this notion of self-loving individuals. And that is a central part of being successful socially, by, in other words, learning to keep that under control, and also to being successful economically. So we don't have a person of two minds. We have the same person, but in his intimate relations, he's careful not to do offensive things.
Okay, how do you switch to the last slide? Switch to the last slide.
Okay.
Any other questions? Yeah.
About Smith's axiom that we know ourselves through others, what role does introspection play in this axiom, if any? Can we have an accurate image of ourselves through introspection?
Alan, can you?
Why don't you stand up
Yes.
and ask the question a little louder?
Okay.
Us old people can't hear well.
Okay. So about Smith's axiom that we know ourselves through others, my question is, what role, if any, does introspection play in this axiom? Can we have an accurate picture of ourselves?
Perfection?
Introspection.
Introspection. Well, you see, introspection is a modern word, the way I would say it. Introspection is a modern word for Adam Smith's metaphor of the impartial spectator. You see, when you introspect, you are looking at your situation, your experience, your relations with others. All of this sort of thing is involved in introspection. But Adam Smith's got that basic idea, the way I see it, in 1759. And, you know, the book, it's a work in social psychology. Because, you see, Adam Smith would say there's no such thing as individual psychology that's separate from our social experience, so that he would see social psychology as the primary driver of who we are and our mental activity as individuals. Out of that, maybe there are things that relate to the individual. You can talk about individual psychology, but that's the driver of it.
Someone back there had a question? Yeah.
There was, so I may have missed it, but one of your slides mentioned that there was a difference between the world of outcomes and the world of rules. I was wondering if you could go into more detail about the differential there.
You see, the world of rules involves outcomes. You see, think of action as a mapping from circumstances into outcome. Part of the circumstances are the payoffs of those outcomes. See, we always observe the outcomes. And that's why it was natural in neoclassical economics just to focus on the value of those outcomes. But you see in these examples I've given you, and in the example with a homeless man that is richer than that, you see, and there is a context, and you see the homeless man and I'm sure he didn't doubt that I preferred more money to less, and he prefers more money to less. And that's part of the equation. You see, the payoffs are not irrelevant. They're part of it, but it's in a richer context. And, and it's underlies all of our human sociality. It's the means by which we get along, if we do get along, and when we don't get along, it's essentially because negative reciprocity gets out of control. You know, the downside, remember, Adam Smith tells us, is far worse than the upside. See, people don't tend to compete in doing better and showing gratitude to each other. They're more likely to get locked into punishment. You punish me, and then I resent that. I punish you even more, and pretty soon it's out of control. So the Smith's idea is very important in understanding, helping you to understand from a different perspective the whole problem of in-groups versus out-groups. One of the basic propositions in Adam Smith is that we are much more concerned that our friends share our enemies than that they share our other friends. Okay? We can tolerate our friends, we can understand that some of them are not friends with our other friends. But it's very hard to get along with a close friend who likes your enemy. You see, that's where. And you know, you're reading about in the paper every day. Exactly that, you see. And I think it's really great to read what he says about these things. He had it nailed.